It's the silliest. Like my nurses always chuckle. So I'm like, yeah, I'm a doctor, but not that kind. But like, I've got skin in this game. If you do poorly in this class, if you come away learning nothing, I lose my job.
The opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not reflect the views or opinions of their respective employers. Any content provided is for informational purposes only and do not constitute endorsement or representation by any company or organization. Welcome to the Psychology of Business podcast, where we explore the intersection of psychology, business, education, and the news. I'm your host, Brandon Griffin, and today in our virtual studio, we have Dr. Noah Trudeau. Welcome, Noah.
Hey, Brandon. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you here. Noah Trudeau is an assistant professor of data analytics in the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University. His research includes occupational licensing, regulation, and pedagogy. Noah completed his bachelor in econ from Jacksonville State University, his master's from Troy University, and his PhD in economics from West Virginia University. Is there anything I forgot or missed from your bio?
I am also a super heavyweight class amateur strongman, one-time sumo wrestling winner, and I'm just all around great to hang out with.
Yeah, definitely. So thanks for coming on today. So I work with Noah, and he's great, and he's fun. We go to lunch sometimes. We're actually working on a couple projects together, but I wanted to bring him on, and I wanted to talk about econ. I wanted to talk about data analytics. I wanted to talk about his background and what he's been working on. So Noah, let me ask you this question. When you were a kid, you always dreamed of being an economics data analytics professor. Is that correct?
100%. They just didn't tell me that was a thing. No, legitimately, this is a great way to start this whole thing. I really liked Gilmore Girls growing up. I was a big Gilmore Girls fan as like a little kid. So I wanted to go to Yale. That was the only thing that I knew at like 8 was that I wanted to go to Yale because Rory Gilmore wanted to go to Yale. And I thought Yale sounded cool. Didn't know anything about Yale. Kind of knew it was an Ivy League. So I wanted to go to Yale. And that kind of actually like sent my whole career because at the time, I'm originally from Alabama. Alabama had a public scholarship fund where the state you could put money into the fund, the state would run it, and you could get 4 years of education. That was the whole thing, was around the early 2000s, right around turn of the century. The Alabama, I think it was called the STAR program, if I recall correctly. You could donate in, and essentially it would pay for a 4-year college degree from an Alabama State University.
Wow. So
at the age of 10, it must have been pre-2005, because there was no way I was a 5-year-old saying I wanted to go to Yale. But I might have been in second grade. I might have been a 7-year-old saying I wanted to go to Yale. But around that time, I was like, yeah, I want to go to Yale. So my mom, who was considering my college education at the time, said, well, I can't put into the STAR program because no one wants to go to Yale, and Yale's in Connecticut, and the STAR program won't pay for it. So that was where it all started. I thought, and then for a long time, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, which I'm glad I didn't go that route, because that would have been miserable. I mean, grad school is miserable anyway, right? Right, Dr. Griffin. So, but yeah, I'm so glad that the lawyer route didn't happen. I'm insufferable as it is. I mean, put me in a courtroom, it would have been even worse. Like, talk about like a complex. That would, if I had been a lawyer, it would have really happened. But yeah, no, I was a kid who liked math. I went to math. I was a second place math B runner up in 6th grade or 7th grade or 8th grade, something like that. I've got the trophy in my parents' house somewhere. I liked puzzles. I was in the gifted ed program, which, I mean, of course, has led to me being diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. But I like to read. I loved learning things, and that hasn't changed. Like, I'm an adult, and like I'm happy to learn new things all the time. So that was where it all started. And like, I was certainly the little kid who had no idea what he wanted to do.
Yeah,
I had the idea of what I didn't want to do more than anything. I had that list kind of going.
And what was that? What's like the number one thing you like didn't want to do?
Medical doctor. I get the faint at the sight of blood reaction, which is called the vasovagal reaction. I believe it's your vagus nerve. It's in the back of your head. what happens is it gets like too excited and then it just cuts off the blood to your brain. And I've had that my whole life.
So you loved Gilmore Girls, but you did not like Grey's Anatomy.
No, absolutely not. And it's so funny the things that have like triggered it, like in my lifetime. I almost fainted watching Deadpool, the first Deadpool movie. I fainted during a haircut once because they were working on me with a straight razor, and I got a little freaked out. I faint when I get my finger pricked. Usually, if I'm not like looking away, but those little things, like it's the silliest. Like my nurses always chuckle because I'm like, yeah, I'm a doctor, but not that kind because I'll faint.
Yeah.
And then they're like, okay, we're gonna give you a little, a little steroid shot, a little prick here, and it's like, cool. I'm gonna look over there, or else you're gonna have to like be picking me up off the floor. So medical doctor was never on the list. At some point, like politician got knocked off too. I was in SGA as like a high schooler. Did a little bit of SGA as an undergraduate, and that it turned me off of like governing. I don't like that. I don't like having power over other people either. So that was a big like meh to me. And so that kind of strewed me away from like the lawyer route also.
So you've talked about, lawyer was interesting for a little bit. Politics was interesting for a little bit. Econ's very similar. So as an undergrad and now sometimes when I think about economics, I think about big picture, macro. I think about inflation rates. I think about central bank. What are they doing? But where am I wrong? What does econ... What is economics? If you had to put it simply, what is econ?
Oh, easy peasy. So economics is the science of decision making. So a lot of people do they think big picture, they think macro, they think GDP, they think interest rates. Like you said, they think money. Money comes up a lot. Stock market comes up a lot. That's finance though. So I try to steer them off of that. But I mean, fundamentally, economics is all about why we make the decisions we do. My advisor says economics is a set of eyeglasses with which to look at the world. So it's a toolkit. It's a way of thinking about things. If we think of you've had undergraduate business classes. Economics is a way of talking about behavior in kind of like the human condition. And economics is an interesting space because, like you said, law kind of fits in that kind of philosophy space. Economics wasn't a thing until turn of the century 1900. So prior to that, we had political economy, and political economy then divulged into economics, philosophy, and political science. And so we had this idea of what an economist wasn't a thing until around 1900, right around the time of Keynes, is when we finally had kind of the term economist. So where we've attributed the first economist to someone like Adam Smith or David Hume, they would have never considered, they wouldn't have even known the word economist. They might have called themselves political economists, but it was this like mishmash of governing and how a country should be run and how to prosper. That's where we started. But fundamentally, I like to think of economics as it's the science of decision making. I tell my students, economics is what you do when you realize you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing that. So economics is decision making. That's wild. Even now, even though I'm organizational behavior, I focus on psychology. I focus on decision making, maybe from individuals from more of a psychological perspective. That's really interesting. So you go through your bachelor's, you go through grad school, you get into your PhD, and you're working on econ. And what type of challenges, what type of problems are you trying to solve? What are you looking into as a doctoral student in economics?
So I am an applied microeconomist. So I don't do any of the macroeconomic stuff that we usually talk about. I don't talk about interest rates. I don't talk about GDP. I care about microeconomic problems, and specifically, I care about microeconomic problems that are caused by or can be solved by government. So more localized governments. So while I was a master's student at Troy, at our lovely employer, while I was a master's student, one of my professors turned me on to the topic of occupational licensing. And it was something that I hadn't thought about really at all. Like I was aware that there were licenses for things. At one point, I thought I could just become a massage therapist. Like I thought like, oh, this would be a good way to like work through school. Like I could just, do like 4, 6 hours, 8 hours of massages a week, make, $400. I don't know how much I would make, and pay for all my like alternative things on the like side, right? Like
Yeah.
I go out to dinner with my friends. I could get a beer at the bar
Mm-hmm.
or something. I could live not in a dorm and pay rent. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I was aware that occupational licensing was like a thing, but I wasn't aware of how pervasive it was. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's out there. So occupational licensing affects more than 20% of the U.S. workforce. So one in
Really?
five.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is the counterpoint to that is it is almost 10 times more, or about 10 times more effective than the minimum wage. So the minimum wage affects about 1.5% to 2% of
Mm-hmm.
workers, maybe up to 2.5%. I haven't looked at the data recently. It's less than
Yeah.
2.5%, I'm sure. So 10 times more people are affected by an occupational license than there are people affected by the federal minimum wage.
Hmm.
And yet it gets no discussion by comparison.
So occupational licensing, so if I'm an accountant, I need to become a CPA. If I'm a doctor,
Yep.
I need to pass the boards. If I'm a lawyer, I need to pass the bar. Does that count as occupational licensing?
Absolutely. So all three of those are great examples. The CPA exam is you have to have a CPA license. To do so, you have to pass the exam. Doctors are generally licensed physicians,
Mm-hmm.
is what you think of. And the bar exam is a form of occupational licensing as well. But you also see it in things like your barbers, your massage therapists, your natural hair braiders. You see it in things like your prosthetists, the people that make prosthetic limbs. You see it in hearing aid dispensers. You see it in plumbers, electricians, contractors. I mean, we could go on and on and on, but it is so many more occupations than you would think. The person that repairs your air conditioning at your house probably has some form of HVAC license or cooling license.
And where does that come from? Is that state? Is that federal? Is that county? Who does that licensing? I'm sure it's all over the place, but
So
where does
most
that come from?
occupations are licensed at the state level. There are a few federally licensed occupations with federal standards, and there are some local ones. So in terms of electricians, that is generally something you would see at a state level.
Mhm.
Although states like Tennessee, New York, and a couple others have local licensing. So every local municipality or county determines their licensing schema, I guess would be the way you could talk about it, what the requirements are. But for the most part, we see it at the state level.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
So when you're
none for college professors though. We do not have to have a license. So we're in the like not as big of a majority as we think though.
Yeah. So what are you working on? Are you just tracking all that? Are you trying to push for more licensing, less licensing? Is this a politicized issue?
It's surprisingly apolitical, I guess I would say. It is political in nature, that it is done by like the legislative branches of government.
Yeah.
But it is something that is surprisingly not a debate between the two sides of the aisle. So we've seen publications both from like the Obama and the Trump White House on the need for more common sense licensing, not necessarily less licensing, but definitely better licensing, I guess would be a good way of defining it. And all of my work, I guess if you were to look at it from an outside point of view, it would look like I'm against occupational licensing.
Yeah.
But what I try to tell people is I'm not against occupational licensing. I am against unnecessary hurdles or things. So the reason why we have occupational licensing is it's exclusively for service-based occupations. You can't verify the quality of a service until after you've received the service. So your barber knows about how good of a haircut they can give you. They don't know exactly. You have no idea for the most part until that haircut is done. Now, if you had a very high quality barber, they know they're high quality. If you have a very low quality barber, they know they're low quality. There's a level of like individual understanding. But until you get that haircut, you don't know how good of a job they're going to do. Even your low quality barber could give you the best haircut ever. Or your high quality barber could slip. Something like that could happen. The idea with occupational licensing is to have a minimum quality assurance, I guess we could say. The state has verified that this individual can do a good job.
So you must be this good or follow these minimum regulations to perform said service.
Therefore, when you go to get that service, you have some assurance that a minimum quality will be obtained, which is great for things like your brain surgeon, because we
Yeah.
certainly do want our brain and heart surgeons to be of a minimum quality standard.
At minimum, yeah.
Yeah, we say there's a lot of harm that can be done by somebody in that space.
Yeah.
But with something like your barber, what is the actual implicit cost of a bad haircut? You know, like even if my barber accidentally just clicked the shears all the way to 0 and just did like one of those, you know, cartoon right through my hair, you know, maybe I get it all done and I look kind of silly for a little while, but that's not. I'm not dead. Like that would be the ultimate cost, but there are lots of costs along that space.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of inconsistencies that we see between states, across states, within states, over what gets licensed and what doesn't. So one juxtaposition that is often mentioned in the occupational licensing talk is mechanics are usually not licensed at all. Car mechanics.
Really?
These people are working on your brake lines, working on your engine, things that could cause your car to fail. Generally, they're just some sort of outside or third-party certification. That is a verification of quality that is not done by the state. And even more important, it's voluntary. And if you don't have that certification, you don't go to jail for doing the job. So licensing is the most strict barrier with the highest cost to not having it. So if you try to be a barber or a massage therapist or whatever without a license, practicing without a license comes with criminal conviction. Like you can be arrested, you can go to jail, you can spend a lot of money on fines. It is a big thing if you were practicing without a license. My significant other Elizabeth and I have been watching Suits these past, like we've been going back along with most of America, I think, have been rewatching Suits. And that's actually the plot. Like the underlying plot of Suits is the main character does not actually have a law degree, did not pass the bar legally. Like he did it for other people. Like he snuck in and took the exam, but he did not officially pass the bar. He does not officially have a law degree, and he's practicing as a lawyer. He is committing fraud, essentially. And so that's what happens if you practice without a license. You can go to jail. You can be in a lot of trouble.
And that's really interesting because I feel like, you know, we use the example of a mechanic and we use the example of a barber. And it seems like in terms of financial cost and maybe mortality or maybe damage that someone can cause, a mechanic has a lot more liability. You know, you're working on 1,000-pound vehicles, working on the, you know, going on the freeway. If somebody's going 75 miles per hour on the freeway, their brake line breaks because this person wasn't properly trained. That could cause thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage. That could risk multiple lives. Whereas a barber, you know, a bad haircut, maybe you don't get the job at your job interview, or maybe you look silly in front of your crush, or maybe, you know, you just wear a hat for a couple of weeks. So that's really interesting, that just the difference in licensing requirements.
Right, absolutely. And we see it, unfortunately, there are some awful roots historically of why we see licensing in certain occupations. So things such as barber licensure does go back to post-Civil War and Jim Crow laws. But then we also see licensure stemming from tragedies, licensure stemming from the one that I've seen most recently, states in the past like year and a half, a lot of them are passing sign language interpreter licenses. And I have the bet that it's because of these people that somehow managed to get on stage at the Super Bowl and they're signing the national anthem or something. And people are like, that's not what that is. They don't know what they're doing.
Well, it's kind of that thing. Who would pretend to be an ASL interpreter? Who would pretend to do sign language on national TV? You know, that's not something anyone would ever think of. But in the last couple of years, we've seen these stories of people at the Super Bowl or at these speeches who, you know, seem like they're doing sign language, but in reality, they're not. I definitely think that's the cause of people doing these licensure. So
we see that, and then we also see licensure stemming from other things that are licensed. So Milton Friedman actually has a paper on this, which is one of my favorite fun facts. Is Friedman did work on occupational licensing. He discussed the occupational licensing transition of doctors to dentists. So physicians was one of our earliest licensed occupations.
Yeah.
Of course, right? You want your doctors to have a minimum quality standard. You want
Mm-hmm.
proof of that, hence the license. Dentists then lobbied to also get that license to prevent entry of just kind of like flooded entry of whatever dentists. And so we see that dentistry becomes licensed after physicians. And so we see this adjacency movement. So other things that have become licensed in the past 10 years, things like music therapists become licensed because therapists are licensed. And you can see that there's not a big jump between therapists and music therapists, at least cognitively, that's ironic, right?
Yeah.
Cognitively. But we see little movements like that is, this occupation is pretty adjacent to that occupation. This should probably be included. And to some extent, sometimes it is restriction of competition, which us economists, I should say, hate, right? Markets rule, restrictions in government and red tape rule kind of thing. But we can see where those kind of happen. And to some extent, we also see licensing stems from there's this adjacency thing, and then in like the healthcare industry especially, we see licensing stem from kind of a fault of our healthcare system in that we pay for a lot of things through health insurance. So things like a music therapist, if they want to be able to bill insurance, sometimes insurance companies require you to be a licensed practitioner. And if you say, well, my state doesn't have a license, they say too bad. So what do you do as a music therapist? You go to your state legislature and you say, hey, we need to be licensed. We need a board of music therapists, or we need to be included among the licensure. Can you create this license for us? Therefore, I can get paid by, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Aetna, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They will only pay out to a licensed practitioner. So we see things like that.
Yeah. So as you're working on occupational licensing, are you working on recording occupational licensing? Are you working on changing? Do you want to enact change? What's your overarching goal with doing this work?
My overarching goal is I would like to see a little more common sense when it comes to licensing, because these are laws that go into place. Often they'll get put into place and they'll stay in place forever, because that's kind of how we do law in the United States. Is when precedent is set, precedent takes place forever.
Yeah, this is a bad example, but Roe v. Wade, when Roe v. Wade got overturned, a lot of people were going back to laws from early 20th century, sometimes even further than that.
Yeah, so if there is a law in place, it's hard to remove. It's easy to put in. It's hard to remove.
Yeah.
And luckily, we do have some of this in state legislatures with what we call sunset review or sunrise review. Sometimes they call it that as well. And that is this constant checking of whether or not these things need to be continued.
Yeah.
So, for example, Alabama, the state of Alabama does have an Alabama Sunset Committee where they look at all of the boards and then they decide whether or not this needs to be continued as far as a license. One issue with that is usually the only people that are fighting for or against are the people that have a little bit of skin in the game. So if your barber licensure is up for sunset review, the only people that like show up to the meeting to talk about it are barbers who want to continue the licensing, people that already have the license. Not very many people like me would come up and say, well, let's consider all of the facts at hand. With my research, so one of my major project is with the Archbridge Institute. It's called the State Occupational Licensing Index. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do is just give each state or anyone who cares an idea of their state's propensity to license, their tendency to, whether they like it or not. So for last year, we did our inaugural issue. This year, we're doing our second issue. And all we've simply done is we've looked at a set of occupations, just a little more than 300, about 330 occupations that are licensed in multiple states or just one state, at least licensed somewhere.
Yeah.
And we have looked at whether or not that license exists for that occupation title, or if you need some sort of license to perform that occupational title. So an example would be something like, there we go. I'll go back to the hair braider. In 33 states, you do not need an occupational license to be a natural hair braider. In 17 states plus DC, you do.
Yeah.
In most of those states, it is a natural hair braider license. But in 3 or 4, you actually have to have just a cosmetologist license, which comes with a lot more cost than the natural hair braider license, because you have to learn how to do nails. You have to learn how to do like makeup, like an esthetician sometimes has to do. You have to do, you have to know manicures, pedicures, and all of the things that have to deal with cutting hair, not just braiding. So in that case, we would say that in our index, we quantify things as barriers and licenses. So a barrier means having some sort of occupational license to do that job's tasks, whereas a license means like a specifically named license for that task. So if you have to have a cosmetology license to do hair braiding, you have a barrier, but you don't have a specific license. If you have to have a natural hair braider license, you have a barrier and a license. And so we're trying to get an idea both of states' propensity to license with this barriers idea, but also a little bit of an idea of like the red tape involved with whether or not they're going to put in a new license for a new occupation. So we're ultimately, we're just trying to get at, does your state like to license? If so, and the idea being, if a new occupation came out, something or some sort of like a branch of an occupation existed, we would like to have an idea of whether or not a state would license it, whether or not a state would license it under an occupational license that already exists, or whether or not they would create a new board kind of thing. So that's the idea with that. And ultimately, it is not a politically motivated process, but it is a legislatively motivated process, because very few people know that these are things. Like if I were to tell you that, you know, your home state of Utah licenses, like I can't think of Utah specifically, but licenses hearing aid fitters or something, that is one that is commonly licensed. You would say, no, I had no idea. And then I say, yeah, well, among that, they also license 300 other occupational titles that you're probably like aware of what they might do. Now, if you talked about like professional geologists, which have licenses in most states, maybe that one's a little obscure. But things like barber, hair braider, optician, those things you probably aren't aware of, and you aren't aware of like the legislative cost that comes with it. And neither are the people that are sitting in your House of Representatives or your Senate. So our goal is to just aid to the awareness of these, because they're costly, both in terms of economic mobility, sometimes in terms of physical mobility. Because if you can't bring your plumber's license to another state, you might not move.
Definitely. So you mentioned something about it's not necessarily politically motivated, but is there a correlation between if a state's red versus blue versus the amount that they license versus what they don't like to license, or does it kind of depend on the individual states?
Based on our findings last year, surprisingly, no. It does not seem to correlate with more Democrat or more Republican states, or controlled state, Democratic or Republican controlled. Our 3 most licenses this past year were Arkansas, Texas, and then Alabama. And I don't remember the 3 best, but I know the best was Kansas. So we red and blue states across the board. The states that most people would guess as being very like regulatory heavy, people tend to throw out like New York, California. They all fell sort of in the middle. California fell to 11. I think New York fell in the bottom half.
Really?
There was a lot of geographical correlation. So Alabama, Texas, and Arkansas being at the top are all like in the southeast, along with a few other states that are similar in that nature. The Midwest was the best, or like what we might call the Midwest was the best in terms of the least barriers to entry. So are like Wyoming, Utah, Nebraska space. The Northeast, like in like the New England or like the Mid-Atlantic region, not like overly stand out compared to like Indiana or Florida. Like we had more geographical correlation than political correlation. And to some extent, we expect that to be, we call it T-boo competition or yardstick competition. You measure you perform politically similar to your neighbors,
Yeah.
because those are the people that you're most competing with in terms of where somebody might move to.
Well, yeah, you're going to
So
have the most migration to the
yeah,
states next to you. So if someone requires a license that you don't have, obviously that's going to be very motivating for them to get that license or to, be involved
right,
in that process.
exactly. Or as I call it the Alabama doesn't have a lottery rule. So I drive to Columbus, Georgia when the
Hmm.
Powerball hits a high enough number.
Are we going to go next time it gets up there?
I would gladly take a ride with you out to get a lottery ticket. But yeah, no. So there is like there's geographic flexibility, right? If you want to be
Hmm.
close to your parents, sometimes close to your parents means you can live one state over.
Yeah.
If that means that you have an easier requirement for licensure,
Hmm.
and we see this happen with things like nurse practitioners.
Yep.
So not only are nurse practitioners licensed in a lot of states, if not all, they have different scope of practice laws. So in some states, nurse practitioners can perform as their own individual physician. They can
Yeah, I
have
know in
like a family
Utah they
practice.
opened that up, and they said PAs can now be, or not PAs, nurse practitioners can now run their own offices,
Yep.
and that was a really big deal because it opens a lot more opportunity for
It
people to have
gives
their own practices. A lot more people can actually get into the doctor, get into a medical professional, and get help.
it gives a lot of access. And then also, if you are looking somewhere, I lived in Morgantown, West Virginia while getting my PhD. Morgantown is right on the Pennsylvania border. If I was a nurse practitioner looking to practice, I could practice in Morgantown, West Virginia or Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and be within an hour. If
Hmm.
one of those let me open my own practice and that's what I wanted to do, I'm going to live in that one.
Hmm.
Right. And I can still live within an hour of maybe like my preferred place. So if I
Yeah.
wanted to hang out in Morgantown, like if I lived in Uniontown, it's not that far away. Or if I wanted to live in Uniontown because that's where mom and dad are, I could live in Morgantown if that meant that I could have my own
Hmm.
practice. So we see these decisions on the margin based on these things. And we see instances of people choosing not to migrate places
Yeah.
because of it as well. And I guess the big thing that I would love to see is a lot of states are passing what we call universal licensing recognition. So
Hmm.
they're saying if you have a license from another state, you can get a license here. Just send it, mail us in and say, I have a plumbing license from California, but I really want to move to Alabama. Can you give me a plumbing license? And a
Yeah.
lot of states are just like, yes. And so Arizona was the first to do that. They did just blanket universal licensing recognition. Their governor, former CEO of Cold Stone Creamery, said, if you're working in California, you have a professional license, we'll take it. Because you don't want to live there because real estate prices are going up. Tempe will have you. Um, Flagstaff will take you.
Hmm.
If you want to live in Arizona, come and live in Arizona, and we'll let you practice with whatever license you had.
And I think that's great. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, so we've seen quite a few states pass that. Some have qualified it with
Hmm.
having a significantly similar license.
Yeah.
So they get to choose whether or not another state's like requirements are good enough,
Hmm.
which is like a little petty in a way, but also like we'll take what we can get. I'd love to see the blanket universal licensing recognition. It is good fundamentally to allow people that physical migratory ability.
Hmm.
Um, and we've seen my friends and colleagues, Ed Timmons and Kiwan Bay, who are members of the NE Regulatory Research Center at West Virginia, have they have currently a working paper on how that affects like actual like migratory patterns, whether or not universal licensing recognition means people are more likely to move to your state. Last year, 2023, Virginia passed theirs,
Mm.
explicitly
Yeah.
looking to get more people to move to Virginia. So
Mm.
we'll see if it works. Hopefully, it does.
Yeah. So your friends took occupational licensing and they're applying it to other aspects. So what other work are you doing aside from occupational licensing? What else are you working on right now? What else excites you?
Oh, I love teaching.
Hmm.
So that is it surprised a lot of people while I was in grad school how
Yeah.
excited I was about teaching. And I think that is something that's indicative about this like ivory tower phenomenon that is higher education.
Hmm.
Um, I got into economics because I wanted to teach economics to people, and I didn't want to teach
Hmm.
in high school. I didn't want to teach in elementary school
Yeah.
if those jobs existed.
Hmm.
Um, but I wanted to share this wonderful thing that I knew about with anybody that would listen.
Hmm.
So I remember it was my senior year of undergrad. One of my colleagues said, "What are you going to do with an econ degree?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, I think you should do this. And I had just given a presentation on something in an econ class. He said, I think you should do this. And I said, let's do it. And so I looked at my professor at the time, Dr. Cynthia McCarty, who's still at Jacksonville State. I think she's got to be retiring soon. I feel like she's been there a century. But Dr. McCarty has taught every macroeconomic class at Jacksonville State for years. And everybody loves Dr. McCarty. So maybe that's why she's still there. But I looked at her and I said, how do I get your job? What do I do? What do I have to do to be your job? And she goes, well, you got to go to grad school. And I said, okay, how do I do that? And that's where it went. And so I've always loved teaching, and I love thinking about thinking, if that makes any sense. So I've done a little bit of work. Currently, I'm working on. We're working on a paper. We are working on whether or not. What are we titling this thing? Whether or not student success workshops improve academic behavioral confidence, right? Is that what we're titling it?
Yep. So Noah, Dr. Trudeau, he has a program called PASS. And what does the acronym stand for again?
PASS is practical note-taking, applicable time management, sustainable study habits, and simple self-assessment and mental health.
I love that. Yeah. So essentially what we're doing...
We love an acronym.
Yeah, so essentially what we're doing with PASS is he developed this program was it at West Virginia or was it at St. Francis? So
while I was at West Virginia, they were studying, I did a pilot program where they were studying the most DNF courses. And one of those courses was microeconomics. So microeconomics 1 or principles of economics 1, principles of microeconomics. And I was teaching a class of 210, which is standard size for microeconomics classes at West Virginia. I was teaching a class of like 210. There was another big class of between like 150, 250. And that was one of the most failed, dropped, or stopped attending classes. And among that, I mean, there were things like Bio 1. There were a few. They were all STEM related-ish. But they were all pretty much like general studies for your college, at least. So I believe there was also like a calc class or like an algebra class, like one of those intro level math classes. And WVU was really trying to get at like why, like what's happening? What causes students to ghost classes? What happens to like confidence? Why do they just bail? And I was the not control class. I was we're implementing things in it class. And one of those was 3 workshops, one on note taking, one on time management. I think maybe it was 2. Maybe there was a study habits. It was 2 or 3. So it was the first 3 of PASS were things they had implemented. And in surveys, students said that they helped. And maybe they did. I have no comparison course for that now. But students said it made them reconsider. It made them more likely to attend class. It made them feel more confident about class. Made them just feel better about school. And these are things that we've noticed. I'm sure you have noticed this in your classroom as well. I feel there's a hesitancy to answer questions.
Yeah.
There's like a fear of getting things wrong. There's students, there's a preference over just not turning something in and getting a 0 than doing it poorly. There's a lack of note taking in terms of like literally writing things down. So I see less and less students each semester writing things down. I see more students taking notes on computers or on laptops, or I guess laptops, computers, on tablets, on whatever, but I see less like physical pen and paper. And I worry that some of that is causing retention issues or success issues. And so I thought, is it an issue of high schools aren't doing this? Like they're not teaching this anymore? Or like, are we just missing this somewhere? And so my significant other was a 4th grade teacher before leaving the teaching field for what she does now. And I would hear her talk about the onus put on elementary school teachers for more STEM, for more science, more math, more science. Make sure they can do this. Make sure they can do that. And there's so much of like, you're learning these complex topics at such a young age. It's like, are you learning problem solving? Are you learning self-management? Are you learning like things that like help stick for you? Or are we just pushing more and more further down, trying to like check these boxes of like, yeah, our fourth graders know calculus now. Like, and so I've spent a lot of time learning about myself. And the thought was, maybe I can help. You know, I've spent the past decade thinking about how I think. And I've had moments where I've told friends or family or somebody, it's like, yeah, you know, I used to think about this way. And now I think about it this way. And they'll say like, I wish you had told me that 10 years ago. Like that would help me. I joke with my students that you think you have to write on your paper in portrait. They give you lined paper. So you think you have to take your notes top to bottom, left to right. You think you're not allowed to sketch in your notes. You're not allowed to draw doodles because that's immature. We put these rules in place. And I say, turn your notebook sideways. Take it landscape. The whiteboard is landscape. So if your professor's writing left or right across a whiteboard and they go all the way to the end, maybe you're having trouble making that connection. Turn your paper sideways. And I'll have people look at me like I'm insane. And then I have some that like they look at me and their eyes get big and they go, I never thought I could do that. And then I'll see students in my classes turning their paper sideways and writing across it.
And that's something you never think about. So when thinking about things, that's just something you never realize it. As you were talking, it kind of got me the idea of, if you've never been to the gym before, or if you have never used a machine before, you can read the instructions and you can look up a YouTube video and you can generally understand how to use a machine at the gym.
Right.
But if there's someone there, if there's a personal trainer, or if there's a friend saying, hey, yes, you're on the machine and you're technically doing it right, but you need to do this. You should be working this muscle. You should be feeling it here. I feel like that's a similar concept. So when people go through school, they can check the boxes.
Yeah, but I'm absolutely doing math.
They are doing math, but are they actually playing the game? Are they actually being successful? Is the point of doing math checking a box, or is it teaching you how to problem solve and teaching you how to apply similar thinking to different types of, formulas? If you're learning the quadratic formula, you should be able to take what you're learning and apply to different things. So I think it's really valuable, because I see students in my class who do things that seem that may seem common sense to one student, where if I ask them 10 questions, they format the paper with 10 questions, and it's formatted really nice, and it's kind of in a format that I'd expect. But I see other students who maybe do it in really big paragraphs, or maybe only do one big paragraph, or struggle with a lot of these little aspects. So even though they're technically checking the box, they may be doing all the requirements, there are little things around the edge that would really help them. So I think the program that you started with, that we're now doing at Troy, is we're just teaching them how to play the game, which is going to make their life so much easier. Because if they can take notes, if they can feel good about themselves mentally, if they can study, if they feel like they can participate more in class, it will make things so much better for them overall. It'll make everything so much better, because I think there is a big disparity. There's a big difference between people in the exact same classroom. So I think this is going to help people who struggle in the classroom really feel like they can succeed and be successful, and also help the students who are doing good unleash that to help them be great.
Right. And it's, to some extent, we see disparities in the classroom not because of effort. We see disparities in the classroom sometimes because of this like lack of knowing the game. Right.
Yeah.
When you read a syllabus and it says learning objectives, I tell my students this. I say, hey, the first thing on the syllabus after my name and phone number and email are these things called learning objectives. And I didn't write those. The university wrote those. The college wrote those based on what they want this course to cover. And if I'm not covering those things, I get fired.
Yeah.
If I want to prove that I know those things, or that you know those things, maybe they should be on the test. And it's just these little things like, hey, you probably never thought about it, but like, I've got skin in this game. If you do poorly in this class, if you come away learning nothing, I lose my job. It is my job to teach you these things. It's going to be assessed somehow. My performance is going to be assessed somehow. Think about like my motivation. Think one step more than like passing the exam. Think about like
Mm-hmm.
why I would put something on the exam. So there's all of these minute things that maybe like we're too busy to consider or we're too overwhelmed to consider, and like
Yeah.
learning like the little tips and tricks along the way. When you pick something up and it's like, oh, this is an easy way to help you with time management. Oh, this is an easy way to help with academic motivation. Here's an easy way to deal with burnout.
Mm-hmm.
Any of those are amazing in their own way. And so maybe our little course of like 45-minute programs can help. Like if it helps one student, it's worth it, right? So we're trying to get that to work, and we're going to see if perhaps they feel it's working for them as well.
Yeah. So at first, what we're doing, we're assessing their academic behavioral confidence. Just do they feel better? And eventually, in the long term, we'd like to see if that actually is reflected in their GPA, if that's reflected maybe in their graduation rates. Because people who feel successful, who feel like they can actually do school, are going to be more successful, obviously. So I think that's a great program we're doing. And I think that's something that's going to be very valuable. I actually made a TikTok video today, and someone was asking the question, why do business professors teach if they've never like worked in the corporate world, something like that. And I was responding, and one of the points I said is that people teach not for the money.
Oh,
Faculty,
absolutely.
professors, we make a good living, but we could earn so much more money if we went out into the industry. The reason why we teach, and I think the reason why most people teach, I know this is why you teach, is because you enjoy talking about the nerdy things that we're interested in, but we also enjoy seeing students being successful.
Absolutely.
So the reason why I teach is because I want people to be successful. I want people to learn about business. I want people to learn about management and organizational behavior and take that and go work in an organization. I'm not teaching because I'm going to get rich. I'm teaching so I can help people. So if we can help the people in the margins, or if we can help the people who are at risk of failing these classes, it's going to make our job so much more better. Because if someone comes to us at the end of the day and says, hey, this was my favorite class this whole semester, or hey, I'm actually interested in this, maybe I should change my major, or hey, you're the reason why I didn't drop out of college. Yep. That's the best thing that we could get. So I think ultimately that's what this class is trying to do, but it's just helping make everyone's lives better.
Right. And like, I mean, to completely illustrate that, one of my cohort members at WVU, he turned down like $1.5 million over 4 years. He had a job offer from Amazon, and instead he took an academic job. And it's not because we're not here because we can't be in that situation. We're here because we have a love for this topic. Mm-hmm. We're here because we have a love for sharing knowledge with each other. Like that is, I think of my position as being a professor is the best job ever, because I get to know everything according to the students. They think I know everything.
Yeah.
And I get to share it. I don't say like, ooh, I'm the professor, I know everything. Haha, I win. It's like, guys, this is super cool. Look at all this stuff. Like it is this, look at all this stuff I know. Here, have it, take it. Let's talk about it. Let's learn. Let's develop this knowledge. Let's problem solve. Let's go crazy, So it's definitely not about the money, right? Like,
yeah, we're earning a little bit less than $1.5 million every 4 years, or whatever.
Whatever that comes out to. Yeah, just marginally less. All right, just a smidge. Mm-hmm. But no, it's all about sharing knowledge. And I think that is what I do it for. Every aha moment I see in a classroom where a student goes, "Oh my God, that's how that works." Mm-hmm. Like that does it for me. That is my dose of serotonin for the year. Yeah. I had a student while I was a grad student teaching. They said, "I'm only taking this econ class. I'm only getting a business minor because my dad wants me to." Yeah. And I said that I totally understand it. That's great. Maybe by the end of this class, we can take you from I hate economics to I see why economics is important. Mm-hmm. Like you don't have to love economics or data analytics coming out of my course, but I want you to at least feel like, yes, this is important for a reason. I could talk about this as an intelligent individual. And when somebody asks me like what the definition of economics or data analytics is, I can tell them. Yeah. And I can hold my own in conversation. So that's what I want. And I want my students to be 10 times more successful than I am. I joke, I say I want all of my students to be the house that gives out the big candy bars at Halloween. You know, that's what I want. So
I think that's great. So someone takes your class, they say, I hate economics, it's the worst. I'm only doing this because my dad's making me do this. At the end of your class, they start to like it. What's the ultimate goal? What students should become econ majors? What is the ultimate goal of an econ student when they graduate? What's the career plan that someone should do if they are going to go into econ? What are some options they have?
So econ is a weird space in that it's you can do anything kind of major. A lot of econ people go into data analytics.
Yes.
See me as example. But it's an interesting space where a lot of econ undergraduates go to law school. A lot of econ undergraduates go to grad school for econ. A lot of econ undergraduates go into political science, philosophy. They become lawyers. They become law school lawyers, right? They become analysts. There's so much econ in sports.
Yeah.
So there's usually an interesting pipeline between like sports and economics. There's a huge pipeline between local government and economics. So you see a lot of econ graduates going and working for the state or going and working for their local municipalities. Econ is all about thinking, but there's so much problem solving involved that people like to hire economists because they can solve problems.
Yeah.
So if you want a degree that says, I know how to solve problems, econ is the place to be. And I always tell people, if you're curious about everything, if you like puzzles, you like problem solving, if you're not terrified of math, if you want to be in that space of business, math, philosophy, computer science, like you were the kid who couldn't figure out what they wanted to do, econ might be the thing. Because it certainly was for me. That was I was all over the place. And I got an econ class. I said, oh, it's got a little bit of everything. Let's go. So that might be the thing for you. Yeah, I mean, it's just so many people come to econ as a science for many different reasons. And for me, it was the many different reasons. It was I'm here because I want to do a little bit of everything.
Yeah. And I think that's great. There's good and bad of a major that has a lot of breadth. It's good because you can do anything, but it's bad because you can do anything.
Exactly.
So I think that's great because it opens up just anything. So I'm that same person. I actually got accepted to law school and PhD at the exact same time. And I had to make that decision. So I think econ, is a great decision. But you were saying something that really interested me. You said a lot of people go into data analytics and you said people go into philosophy. Those seem like complete opposite
completely
ends of the spectrum.
Different. All right.
So what economics is it? Is it more philosophy? Is it science or mathematics? Is it the merging of both? How does that play out?
So I mentioned earlier that economics started as like a merge of political science and what we now think of as economics. But in the past 50, 60 years, well, it's 2020 now, maybe 70 years, economics has taken this space of, should it go more the way of hard sciences, more the way of engineering, more the way of STEM, or should it go more the way of philosophy, psychology? And I think overall it has gone more the way of STEM. So you said, as like a psychologist, you think about behavior all the time. Why isn't economics in that space? Well, what has happened is there is a space of economics that is all about the psychology. We have behavioral economics, which is much more psychology than what we think of as like data, super data driven. It's all about experiments. It's all about lab. It's about like thinking, like getting people to actually do things. But economic theory fundamentally is like an applied mathematics. It is about minimization, maximization. It's about optimal paths. It's about set theory. It's about sets of decisions, set theory. It's about differential equations. Macroeconomics is all about trends and how things behave against trend or how they revert back to trend. So to some extent, economics, and we see this in the discipline, there's an almost constant argument over whether or not it should be more or less mathy. There's a famous paper, and I believe the title was something about on the mathiness of modern economics. And so a lot of people think that having more data, more math, more complex measures makes it better.
Mm-hmm.
And some people push back on that and say, well, if you've completely removed the economic logic, the theory, the philosophy from it, then you're not even really doing economics anymore. You're doing data analytics, you're doing mechanical engineering. And so you see a little bit of divergence kind of in econ students even, or econ programs or econ departments, of these people that diverge between economics as a social science and
Mm-hmm.
economics as an emphasis on the social. Economics is a liberal art even.
Yeah.
And economics is like a social science with emphasis on the science. And it causes a little bit of trouble, I think, amongst departments, amongst students, over whether or not we should be philosophers or whether or not we should be mathematicians. And I think people take they draw a line. A lot of people draw a line in the sand and want to take one side. And personally, I'm someone who tries to straddle it.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of great economic logic, because sometimes the data doesn't exist. We can talk about this thing all day long. We can talk about the economic reasoning and why it might happen and the theory and the philosophy of it, because there's no data. And there are some things where there's a lot of data, and they just said, yeah, this is what the data says. And it's like, yeah, but well, if you don't have any theory to back that up, then spontaneous correlation happens all the time.
Yeah.
So there's a tendency of some people to be on one side of this argument or the other. And I'm one of, man, I'll sit and talk philosophy with you all day long, and we can do this. But if you say like I'm a crack for running like a causal regression, I'm going to look at you like you're crazy. And if you are somebody who doesn't know who Keynes is, then I'm going to look at you like you're crazy. Like there is like a place to be where you can have one foot on either side of this line and say, yeah, I understand the philosophy of it, and I understand the data-driven causality models that go with it. And to some extent, sometimes I think one of the things that is also happening is that data-driven side, there's just more improvement constantly to be made. We're coming up with better models. We're coming up with more impressive econometrics. We're coming up with these crazy big data machine learning things that are awesome, and there's so much more improvement to be made. Whereas like the philosophy side, like it's been there. You can't, like, we've been doing philosophy since Aristotle and Plato, right? Like you can't, I don't think we're getting better at philosophy as humans. I think we're there. I think we figured it out all the way. Unfortunately, question mark. But with the economic space, I think that is something that is happening, is like we're getting new toys on the data side. Yeah. And so it's more and more people tend towards that like data side. And to some extent, they're right. To some extent also, these improvements aren't doing much. Like they're just more accurately describing a phenomenon that we were like pretty sure about. Like one big issue that has come up in the past couple of years is the advances in differences technology. So if you want to look at a causal effect to say something causes something from another, differences is a methodology where you can do that. What that is you look at two things, how they are trending. Hopefully, you would hope they have a parallel trend. They're moving together. Then an intervention happens to one of them, and that is going to change its trend. Yeah. You look at the trend of the other thing, and so you should have equal trend and then unequal trend. And that's how you prove causality. You're like, well, this intervention, these things were moving perfectly together beforehand. This thing happened to one of them, and now they're not moving perfectly together. If they continue moving perfectly together, this is what it would look like. So this difference here is the thing that matters. And you go, okay. Well, they've come out. A person recently discovered that the way we do differences, there was like something to do with the covariance matrix or something. I can't remember there's a treatment group that you're comparing to that you can't. And so we've come out with a bunch of different differences techniques. And like 90% of the time, it's fine. Shows the same thing. Shows it similarly. 10% of the time, like we were wrong by a little bit. And sometimes like more than a little bit, but it wasn't like that bad.
Yeah.
But there was from 2020 to 2024, it's still happening. It's just like, oh, I've got a new way to do the differences of differences technique. I've got a new way to do the differences of differences technique. Hey, based on so and so's new thing, I have this other new thing. Oh, I have a thing that's based on this other thing that's also based on so and so's new thing. So you can combine these four things, and then you get this thing. And it's awesome because it's like science is happening very quickly,
Mm-hmm.
but also it's like, well, what if I had just done it the original way? Like, how wrong was I?
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out, like, a lot of times it's not that bad.
Yeah.
So it's this like, ooh, new toy, and it's like, okay, how does this month's flavor differ from last month's
So
flavor?
it's impactful, it's great, but maybe the real world applicability isn't groundbreaking.
Yeah. So yeah, my coefficient, my estimated coefficient changed by 0.1.
Yeah.
Okay, but I'm more sure. So it's little things like that, and we have this kind of dividing line of like the philosophers are like pointing at the like more mathy people, like, look at those crazy people, and the mathy people are like, look at those people that don't know how to do math.
Mm-hmm. And I think I've seen this as well. So I taught data analytics, just intro data analytics, and I think it's hot right now because big data is exploding. There are jobs in data analytics. I don't know the jobs of economic philosophy, but I imagine that data analytics, business analyst, IT analyst, if you know how to do these tools that you can learn in econ, if you know how to work with SQL or SQL, I know we had that conversation earlier.
Yep.
If you can learn how to do some type of Excel visualization, or if you can do Tableau, or if you can do SQL, or if you can do some other statistics program, R or Python, you can get a high-paying job without you don't even need a degree if you can know those tools. So I think right now it's hot because there's a lot of money involved and there's a lot of data. So I think that's,
and it's a very well-defined space, the data analytics space. You get a job titled analyst, right? Yeah. Blank analyst is the job title that you will get in the data analytics space. Very rarely do you see blank economist getting hired. Sometimes you do, which is kind of cool. So a couple years ago, while I was a graduate student, Wizards of the Coast, who produced Magic the Gathering, hired a principal designer economist.
Wow.
And so that was the coolest thing I had ever seen, was Magic the Gathering wants to hire an economist. What is that even all about? I think I connected with that guy on LinkedIn too. I think he has a Princeton degree. Wow. So like, hopefully they're paying him a lot. That's one of those private sector jobs that aren't teaching that we talk about. Last year, the Major League Baseball hired an economist. As for MLB headquarters, they hired an economist. So we see those occasionally. But, it's one of those, like, most people that get economics degrees don't become economists. Like I am no longer in that space, but that is a minority space to be an economist, to be titled as economist.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at a potential degree and you say, well, what could I do? Then you see salary analyst, you see sales analyst, you see marketing analyst. You go, oh, I could get a data analytics degree and I could do any of those. And so perhaps we might be seeing the students that would have been economic students 20 years ago, 10 years ago, might be data analytics students now. And I might be one of those. Like I graduated from undergrad in 2015, so it's 9 years now. But if I was a student now and I was looking at potential majors, I might be choosing data analytics instead of economics, because it seems a little more straightforward. And it might have just been like whichever class I had first, economics or data analytics. So honestly, the whole reason why I ended up in the business school in the first place was because I took business stats. So, we've come full circle that I'm teaching business stats now. But that might be the trend that we're seeing. I know at least at Troy, we were seeing less and less econ majors, or at least compared to when I was a student here. And we're seeing more data analytics majors.
So are the mathematical economics going towards data analytics and the philosophical oriented economic students staying with econ?
I think the philosophical economics students are staying more towards econ, but they're also potentially moving into other liberal arts. Maybe they're moving into philosophy, literature, that kind of space where they could have that discussion, or even law. They might be staying in that space. So it's difficult to say. I know I have such a small sample of students that I've talked to at Troy that are both data analytics or econ majors. Um, it's just really interesting to see and talk to students now. And it's like, why'd you choose economics? And some students say, well, I had it in high school, which is kind of awesome to hear. And some students will say, like, my dad's an economist. And it's like, who's your dad? Like, do I know him? Because it feels like there's very few of us. It's interesting to see how that kind of affects. So in my cohort of students, two of my cohort members, both of their dads had PhDs in economics. And they went on to get PhDs in economics. Yeah. So there's a little bit of like familial tie to it, I think, also. But I don't think economists are having more economists, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So we've talked about your background. We talked about economics. We talked about occupational licensing. We talked about econ versus data analytics. Is it a STEM science? Is it a social science? Noah, I want to thank you for coming on the Psychology of Business podcast today. Is there anything that excites you right now that you're focused on about the future of economics? Is there anything you want to leave our listeners with?
I am excited about the world, I think. We just got out of what some are calling a vibe session. So a lot of people have thought that we've been doing a lot worse than we have. Yeah. So we actually currently in the world, we're seeing economic growth. We're seeing low unemployment. We're seeing a little bit higher inflation, but it's coming back. I think one of the best things about being an economist or a data analyst is looking at the world and seeing like the true things, the trend, more than just like how I feel. And I think the world's getting better. So I'm excited about 2024. I'm excited about 2025. And, I'm pretty excited about continuing to work with you, Brandon. So that's going to top my list for today also.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Please leave a comment, subscribe. Go follow Noah Trudeau on all the socials. He's awesome. He's a really funny guy. He's great. I want to thank you for coming on the podcast today. You have a great day and happy learning.